Thurgood Marshall led a team of lawyers through many cases. Each victory was chipping away at segregation. Of the 32 cases he appealed before the Supreme Court, he won 29 of them. Martin Luther King was a pastor who was elected to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. He led many peaceful marches, boycotts, and gave many speeches, all trying to unite black people against segregation. He helped organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was dedicated to organizing peaceful protests against segregation. Rosa Parks was an NAACP officer who sat at the front of a bus in the white-only section and refused to give up her seat when she was told to move. She was later arrested. James Meredith won a federal court case which allowed him to enroll in an all-white University of Mississippi. When Meredith arrived on campus, Governor Ross Barnett refused to let him register. President Kennedy then ordered federal marshals to escort Meredith to registration and to classes. This situation led to many riots, arrests, and even 2 deaths. Fannie Lou Hamer was the voice of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. During her speech, she described the police brutality towards her when she registered to vote. In response, many people began to support Hamer and the MFDP. Malcolm X encouraged black people to take control of their communities. He said if peace doesn't work, then he will resort to violence through his ballots or bullets motto. He stated many controversial statements. Floyd McKissick was the leader of the organization CORE. He and other leaders decided to lead marches to finish Meredith's goal. Stokely Carmichael used the saying Black Power, which was said to be a calling for black people to begin making their own goals. He led the SNCC and urged blacks to focus on maintaining black pride. Plessy v. Ferguson was a court decision limiting African Americans' rights and separating the races. The conclusion was separate but equal. African Americans were subject to disrespect from white people, including insults and physical violence. Their facilities were separate, and all black facilities were inferior and in terrible condition. During World War I, 400,000 African Americans were drafted into the armed forces. They were in segregated groups and excluded from the Navy and Marines. Before the Great Depression, most blacks already lived in poverty, and because of the Great Depression, they suffered even greater. The New Deal gave the blacks opportunities that they were not able to have before. During World War II, blacks fought discrimination in the defense industry. They won, and blacks contributed greatly in World War II by taking roles of soldiers, pilots, and nurses.
The NAACP challenged segregation through court cases and nonviolent resistance. Morgan v. Virginia was a 1946 case in which the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional the state laws mandating segregation on buses. Sweat v. Painter was a 1950 case in which the Supreme Court ruled that state law schools must admit black applicants. Brown v. Board of Education was a 1954 case in which the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal education for black and white students was unconstitutional. Some schools resisted the decision of Brown v. Board of Education and kept the segregated school system. A second rule was made, Brown II, which was initiated and which made desegregation mandatory. 9 students volunteered to enroll in Arkansas's Little Rock Central High School. They became known as the Little Rock Nine. White students jeered as the National Guard looked on. In the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in the white section of a Montgomery bus. The driver called the police and had her arrested. Martin Luther King Jr. joined with ministers and civil rights leaders in 1957 and founded the SCLC to offer nonviolent resistance against second-class citizenship. African American protesters sat down for sit-ins at segregated lunch counters and refused to leave until served. The SNCC was organized by Ella Brown to use students' energy to speed up desegregation. Freedom Riders were African Americans who took a bus trip to the South to provoke a violent reaction that would convince the government to enforce the law of desegregation. Grassroots protesting was nonviolent marches and demonstrations beginning in Alabama and spreading throughout the U.S. James Meredith won a court case and enrolled in the all-white college Ole Miss. Mississippi's governor, Ross Barnett, refused him entry. Riots broke out that night, and for months, federal officials escorted him to class. This was an example of desegregating Southern universities. During the March on Washington, 250,000 people marched on the Washington Capitol to get the Civil Rights Bill signed. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up to the podium and delivered his now famous I Have a Dream speech. CORE and SNCC registered as many black voters as they could to gain national publicity. This was called the Freedom Summer. The MFDP political party was created to gain a voice in politics. They chose Fannie Lou Hamer as their speaker, who described how she was jailed and beaten for registering to vote in 1962. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson, which eliminated literacy tests and rose the percentage of black voters from 10% in 1964 to 60% in 1968.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government the power to withhold federal funds from segregated public schools. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests and provided for the appointment of federal examiners in the jurisdictions that were covered. President Johnson had to address the violence that had erupted and the issue of voting rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination and the sale of rental of most housing. It strengthened anti-lynching laws and made it a crime to harm civil rights workers. De facto is segregation that exists by practice and custom. De jure is segregation by law. De facto can be harder to fight, and de facto segregation intensified other African Americans that migrated to northern cities after World War II. Black Power was a call for black people to begin to define their own goals and to lead their own organizations. Martin Luther King Jr. urged for the phrase to be stopped because he believed it would provoke African Americans to violence and antagonize whites. The Black Panthers fought brutality in the ghetto. They advocated self-sufficiency for African American communities. The Black Panthers dressed in black leather jackets, black berets, and sunglasses. They preached self-defense and sold copies of the writings of Mao Zedong. During 1968, in the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King objected to the Black Power movement. He was assassinated on his motel balcony by James Earl Ray. Many riots appeared because of Martin Luther King's death. Presidential candidate Robert Kennedy was soon later assassinated. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 ended discrimination in housing. The Civil Rights Movement gave African Americans a greater pride in their racial identity. African Americans made substantial political gains. Government began to promote affirmative action.